Thank you all so much for coming. We're going to begin by talking about the Labour government, how green it will be, talk a bit about tech, and then talk about the real crackdown that there's been on climate activism over the past few weeks and months. Because this was titled, Will This Be the Greenest Government Ever? I wanted to start with you, Dale, as you've sort of been advocating for this government. You were campaigning for the Labour government before the general election. So can you give us the pitch as to why we should believe that this will be the greenest government ever?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Hello, everybody. At the other side of the election, I was indeed saying that I thought this would be the greenest government that we've ever had. Couldn't even be the greenest government the world has ever seen. And I said that because I believe Labour get the opportunity of the green economy. That seemed very clear to me. They had made some pretty bold commitments like unbanning onshore wind on day one. I think they followed through within 72 hours or something like that. And in all of my talks or talking with people in the Labour Party, it was clear that they were going to go much further, unbanning wind, supporting solar. They had a target of 100% green electricity on the grid by 2030, which is incredible. I'm a really optimistic, adventurous person that tries to do things that look crazy. And to me, 100% green electricity on the grid by 2030, that's just 5 years from now, looks like one of those things. I think it's going to be very hard to do completely, but I think it's great to have a target that's stretching. Even if we get to 90%, we'll have done an awful lot. And I think also, the bar is pretty low if we're talking about will this be the greenest government ever. We've just had 14 years of Tory rule, opening coal mines, drilling for oil and gas in the North Sea, pushing back deadlines for the ban of the sale of new petrol and diesel cars, all manner of things pulling in the wrong direction. And what we have now is a Labour government that sees the economic opportunity of the green industrial revolution and we'll get behind it. That's what I believe.
And so I suppose, just a quick follow-up, because I suppose with politics in general, and potentially this Labour Party sort of in particular, people might have had the experience of them sort of giving good words and then not necessarily following through it. So as someone who is a bit of an insider, you've been in conversations with them, are you confident that they mean what they say when they're talking about going to sort of 100% green renewable electricity by 2030?
Yeah, I am confident. I'm confident in the people that I've spoken to, in the things that they've said and the way that they've said it. I think it's really important that we don't judge all politicians by the same standard, by the way. I understand anybody that became cynical during the 14 years of Tory rule. We had nothing but unfulfilled promises, just lots of words and targets and nothing ever done, lots of culture war rhetoric and just general bad things. We shouldn't be judging this Labour government by the standards of what's gone before us. I argued before the election we should give Labour the benefit of the doubt. We have the chance to do something completely better. But I'm also confident because the truth is in the numbers. For every pound we spend on fossil fuels drilling for new oil and gas, we can get twice the number of jobs and twice the GDP growth if we spend the same pound on renewable energy. So it's a hard economic fact that I think will drive the change that Labour is going to bring in the pursuit of the green economy.
And Carla, you stood against a Labour MP, of course, and you won Bristol Central against Bangham Debonair, in fact. I can sense a lot of people here might have voted for you, Carla. Let's give you just that straight question. Will this be the greenest government ever?
Probably, to be fair, because the bar is low, as Dale said. But we have to, I'm going to do that terribly passé thing of querying the validity of the exam question.
I'm having no questioning of the question on this panel.
Because what is it that really matters? Is it being at the top of a leaderboard, or is it tackling climate change? And does it matter if this is the greenest government ever if it's still not going to be enough to avert catastrophic climate change? Now, don't get me wrong, I am incredibly relieved that we now have a Secretary of State that clearly gets it on climate change. That's a positive, and as Green MPs, we have been really clear in the run-up to the election and since that we will work with the Labour government and with MPs from other parties and none on areas we agree, but we're not going to be shy about speaking up and saying where the policies that they're putting forward are too timid for the crisis that we're in. And in particular, I think it is really important to remember that doing good green stuff doesn't undo the bad climate wrecking stuff. You have to stop doing the bad climate wrecking stuff as well. So, to give you an analogy from healthy eating, right? Building more renewable energy but carrying on opening more oil and gas extraction is like having a Big Mac every day for lunch and dinner, but then having a salad on the side and therefore thinking that they cancel each other out and you've got a healthy diet. So with the things that the Labour government has done in the run-up to and since the election, lifting the de facto ban on onshore wind, yeah, of course, great. As a former wind engineer, of course I support that. But continuing to respecting the Conservative government's decision to open the Rosebank oil and gas field, which will cause 500 million barrels of oil to be burnt that wouldn't have been otherwise. There's your salad and your Big Mac. Here's another one. Great British Energy. Again, I think Great British Energy is quite a positive, promising idea. It's about the government investing, especially in areas of clean electricity generation that would benefit from some extra government investment, like floating offshore wind, which isn't as commercially viable as regular offshore wind at the moment. I think that's a promising avenue to pursue. But let's not forget that before the election, Labour slashed their previously flagship 28 billion climate investment pledge. And so while they are investing in the electricity side of things, the parts of their plan that suffered are the other aspects of decarbonisation. And as Massive Attack themselves have been making this point in and around this event, we have to decarbonise all sectors of our economy. We can't just focus on the bits that are easy and sexy and have wind turbines. We have to decarbonise our home heating and our transport and events and stuff as well. And it is the investment in decarbonising our homes, insulation, heating and transport, which are the areas that the Labour Party has cut, or cut from their plans anyway. If we don't invest in that stuff, it's not going to happen. And just this week, the government announced investment in new cycle routes. Great, I support that. They also announced that London City Airport will be expanded. Context for people who don't know, that's not just any old airport expansion. We shouldn't be expanding airports in a climate emergency because sustainable aviation is not commercially viable yet. But especially London City Airport, because London City Airport mostly serves private jets, which is the most polluting way you could fly, many, many times more carbon intensive than a seat on a regular plane, and mostly doing short journeys that you could easily do by train. So of all the decisions that the Labour government could be making, deciding to allow an airport that serves the super rich, the wealthy elite to take more private jet journeys, that doesn't seem consistent with tackling the climate emergency or with Labour's other professed policies. So, okay, sorry, bit of a rant, but there you go. I think, in summary, there are, I'm sure, many Labour MPs who get it on climate change, and I am reasonably confident that this government will be the greenest government ever because there's a low bar, but I am not confident that they have the commitment and the bravery to pursue the policies that we need that would actually be transformative and to make this country a fairer country as well as a greener country. And that's what us Green MPs will be focusing on, holding them to account and pushing them to be braver.
And Dominique, you've been working obviously in the sort of activism sphere with the youth climate movement. I suppose, how relieved are you to see the back of a Tory government and a Labour government in power, or are you sort of worried that people will think, oh, we've got a Labour government, everything is fine?
Yeah, very good question. I was very relieved to not have a Tory government anymore. I can't remember consciously being aware of not being under a Tory government since I am a young person. However, I think especially when we're talking about is this the greenest government ever, it's so important. I'm in a similar position as Carla here, and yes, because we have previously had a government that has continued to sacrifice our planet and people at the expense of lining more fossil fuel companies' pockets with profits, and have continued to place profits before people and planet, essentially. And we've had such a low bar on climate action. So yes, this is a much better step, and I won't repeat what's been said about the action that they have put forward and have promised that they will take. However, it is so important that we don't look at this and kind of be complacent about pushing forward action and demanding climate justice, because when it comes to the planet, when it comes to climate justice, we can't compromise with it. And climate disasters and the climate ecological crisis cannot be compromised with. And so we have to really demand the action that we need to see, rather than accepting promises. We need to actually see that action come to fruition, especially when we talk about fossil fuels. They have lifted the ban on onshore wind, and they have said that there'll be no new coal licenses, for example. But again, we haven't seen the revoking of existing new oil and gas licenses that haven't yet been extracted, that we don't need at all, that won't lower anyone's energy bills, that won't get us closer to the future that we need to see, to this green and just transition that we need. And again, re-emphasizing Rosebank as someone who supports the Stop Rosebank campaign and is part of it, the Rosebank oil field is the largest undeveloped field that has been approved by the previous government that would emit emissions equivalent to 28 of the lowest income countries. And I think it's so important that we also realize the responsibility that the UK has from the historic emissions and what is happening in the world right now, that people are facing the crisis right now. The climate crisis is very much here. And this is the last government in power before 2030. The year in which we need to have slashed emissions and not be heading towards more climate disaster, the year in which nature loss needs to be permanently reversed. And I feel as though we don't yet have that credible 1.5 degrees Celsius target in place to avoid that. And just to expand on that a little bit, the 1.5 target, which many of you probably know, is in place to avoid the worst of the climate crisis. And we are running out of time, but we do have that window to act. And I think it's really important to make sure that we are holding them accountable and not kind of sitting back and being complacent.
And Dale, I suppose I wanted to put that, I suppose, a challenge from Carla and Dominique, which is that, yes, Labour are doing some good things. So sort of lifting the ban on onshore wind, obviously sort of a fantastic move. I think it'd be difficult to disagree with that. But there are also worrying signs that might give someone doubts about their seriousness on this issue. So I suppose, what's your interpretation of, say, the approval of an expansion of London City Airport or the decision not to revoke some of these oil licenses?
Well, excuse me. I understood the decision not to revoke licenses. It was announced ahead of the election. It was important for Labour to show to the business community that they wouldn't be reckless, that business could have confidence in a Labour government. They hadn't won the election. It was important not to gift the right-wing media with stories about what Labour might do to break contracts and stuff like that. At the same time, I think Rosebank may never go ahead because of other reasons, other factors, such as recent judgments in the courts. And at the same time, we hear about Rosebank being big, which it is, but it is not big in the context of the North Sea, which is 90% empty. It's simply one of the largest projects left. So yes, there's a lot of emissions in Rosebank if it ever comes out of the ground, but most of the damage has already been done. And I'm much more interested in what Labour are doing in confronting the issues that we're facing. Unbanning onshore wind is a massive thing. It will lower our bills. It will drive us to 100% green on the grid by 2030, which is a massive thing. And I'm not seeing a lot of things that Labour are doing that are not big enough or adventurous enough. The airport thing I learned about last week in the middle of an interview. It was news to me. I'm not happy with it. But as I said to the guy at the time, you can't have everything, right? Life is a mixed bag. You can't have everything you want. Labour are pursuing growth as well as green growth. And I think there'll be some things in there that I just don't personally like. But what they are prepared to do is to be bold. Unbanning onshore wind goes against the kind of a certain community in our country that don't want to see things built in the countryside. Easing the path for big solar projects does the same thing. They've gone further than that and said that they will face down NIMBYs when it comes to the building of pylons to connect offshore and big onshore projects to the national grid, because we have to build more pylons. And I listen to what Carla says and what Green MPs say generally about Labour not being good enough, and we hear the commitments of the Greens and stuff like that. But on day one after the election, Carla's co-leader came out against onshore pylons to connect green energy projects to the grid. And I thought, well, what kind of commitment is that to the green future that we need? So I'm just going to, I think you're going to say something.
Can I come back to that?
Yeah,
because that's not true.
Well, I saw it with my own eyes.
So there were lots of reports that, so Adrian Ramsey, for context, your co-leader, was, can you just remind me the constituency he was elected in?
Waveney Valley.
Waveney Valley. And so there were reports that there had been a plan for a pylon and a sort of set of...
So it's a pylon route that crosses East Anglia, and it is designed to connect an offshore wind farm to London and the southeast. There were reports that he opposed the offshore wind farm or the pylons. That's categorically not true. It's interesting to look at who was circulating that misinformation.
So what did he do?
As a hard-working constituency MP, he helped residents in his constituency to respond to a public consultation that the National Grid was running about the route of the pylon. There'd been an earlier consultation, and the result of that had already been some changes to the route, including putting it underground in some parts where they're particularly ecologically sensitive, and he was supporting residents in the constituency to feed into the next round of the consultation, which closed a couple of weeks after the election finished. He is categorically not against offshore wind or renewables or infrastructure in general. He's literally spent the last 25 years since he was in school campaigning for more renewable energy. He's been the CEO of 2 renewable energy charities. But as a hard-working constituency MP, he was helping his residents to engage in a public consultation in order to have their voices heard, which I think is what most people would want their elected representatives to do.
So I suppose as far as I understand, the issue was, so I've heard people say the Greens are blocking this set of pylons, but then I've heard Greens respond and say, no, they weren't blocking them, they just want them to be underground. But presumably putting them underground makes them a lot more expensive and less likely to happen.
I don't think it needs, well, personally, I don't think it needs to be underground in the whole route. I think the point was just looking at where was particularly ecologically sensitive and what tweaks could be made to the plan. That was the point Adrian was making. How can we tweak this to minimise the downsides while keeping the upsides? And by the way, that position that Adrian has taken is exactly the same position that the local Labour MP representing the neighbouring constituency has taken.
I mean, it sounds to me like a conflict between principles, green principles, and actually politics on the ground in the constituency. And what you said is right. If you're going to underground pylons, then you basically rule them out. The increase in cost is just incredible. We have to have pylons, and you know, speaking against them in your constituency, but for them in Parliament. I mean, that's a kind of double standard to me.
I want to bring Dominique here and I suppose make this a bit more general, which is I think there is a conflict within the climate movement and within climate politics where there are people who prioritise stopping the bad things and people who prioritise accelerating the good things. So I think it seems quite clear that the Labour Party have come to power and they're much more sort of prioritising saying yes to the good things and accelerating the good things than they are stopping the bad things. Now the cynical analysis of that is it's because they're in hot to vested interests, and the reason they won't cancel these oil fields is because they're close to these business lobbies. The more sympathetic way of looking at it would be they've decided that in a democracy, electoral politics requires you to do a climate transition while you're making people richer. So they've got to go for growth, and to go for growth, you've got to say yes to everything. So you say yes to the solar farms, you say yes to the onshore wind, but you also say yes to some of the oil fields. And I suppose, how do you relate to that debate of sort of saying no to bad stuff or saying yes to good stuff?
I think as an activist, when we talk about saying yes to everything, if we say yes to everything in the transition, then that in itself cancels out, right? If we continue this green transition, which we desperately need, but are also approving new oil and gas. The International Energy Agency said there cannot be any new oil or gas fields or new fossil fuel projects if we are to have a livable future. And so the idea of continuing the bad things but excusing it by creating solutions and pushing forward solutions, it just doesn't work because, as I mentioned earlier, the climate crisis cannot be compromised with. And it's the same idea that, for example, some companies or businesses can continue the same destruction that they're doing as long as they have things in place to kind of balance out their emissions, such as tree planting projects, which largely for that purpose don't actually work due to planting a lot of non-native trees, etc. But it's like putting a plaster on a massive wound, or it's like throwing a cup of water on a house that's burning rather than actually dousing it out. And I think it's so crucial to remember when we talk about the climate action that we need to see, we're also talking about the way that we need action. And so that includes, social justice as part of it. And when we start these conversations where we consider sacrificing some things or we consider compromising things, we get into a dangerous territory of continuing where people are sacrifice zones as well, continuing where we're leaving people behind. Already we can see how inequalities fuel the climate crisis. Not only do they fuel them, but it's essential to tackle them in order to tackle the climate crisis. So in a very convoluted way to say, no, we cannot continue approving new fossil fuel projects if we are to have a livable and thriving future. And the bold action that I really want to see is making that radical change and actually choosing people and planet over profit. That is the bold action that we need. And I think we talk a lot about the best way to do this politically and to get people on board, but we also need to remember the reality of what we're facing right now. And we really essentially need to see the end to oil fields like Rosebank and remember what we're dealing with.
Can I just say, just to be clear, there have been no new oil and gas projects consented under the Labour government. What we're talking about is them not revoking the licences the Tories issued. Just to be clear, they have not said yes to more oil and gas drilling. Just to be clear.
I suppose I wanted to pick up on this point of compromise, which you mentioned there, because I suppose, Dale, your public persona, your public profile has sort of shifted somewhat in the last couple of years. So you were sort of known, when you were on sort of Question Time as a funder of Just Stop Oil. Now you've stopped funding Just Stop Oil and you've become a strong supporter of the Labour Party. Does that represent a sort of change in your philosophy? Did you sort of come to a realization that sort of compromise and government is more important than activism? Or how do you sort of explain that transition, I suppose?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. So we're talking about last summer, which I think of as the summer of Just Stop Oil. I had funded the group from its inception, a joint protest. I believed in the mission. I thought it was a very simple, completely correct ask, no new oil and gas. I saw Sunak and the Tories weaponize that protest group and the disruption that it caused and the headlines that were created and turn it into something to create a culture war with, to attack Labour with, but also to create this new culture war against people they called eco-yobs. Rishi Sunak called me one of those, for example. And it seemed to me that on top of that, they were doubling down on the issuing of new licenses. It went from a handful to dozens of new licenses, really just to kind of throw fuel on the fire. And I realized that we couldn't stop oil, actually, with more protest, but we could if we stopped the Tories at the next election. Didn't know when it was coming, but it was going to be within about 18 months of that time. So I pivoted from supporting Just Stop Oil to effectively a campaign of Just Stop the Tories at the next election, because that was the way that we could stop oil. We were gifted by the fact that the Labour government gets the green economy and doing all kinds of unimaginable things right now to get us to that point. So there was clear green water between Labour and the Conservatives in that election, and it just seemed obvious to do that to me. It's not so much about compromise, but there's an issue of being pragmatic, actually. If you look at our electoral system, only one of two parties could win, and it just so happened we had a choice. One of those two parties that could form a government did get the green agenda, and we could that way have a green government. We have a green government now.
And I suppose on that issue of sort of compromise, you've obviously got 4 Green MPs, which is the most you've ever had, quadruple you've ever had before. So clearly that's very successful. I imagine what the new Labour government would say is that, it's easier for you in a way to take more strict, let's say, green positions because you're not intending to win a majority at the next election. The Labour Party might say, we have to make more compromises. And they'd say it's easier for you to take these stances because you're only trying to win seats in these very specific places. When you sort of formulate green policy, are you thinking this is a platform that could win 51% of the public, or are you thinking this is a platform that can win 10% and that's what we're looking for?
So first of all, yeah, of course, we were realistic going into this election and the next one that I'm not going to be getting the keys to number 10 anytime soon. But ultimately, I do want to work towards Greens in government. We have Greens in government in countries all over Europe. We had them in government with our sister party, the Scottish Greens, until recently. And even though they were the junior partner, they managed to push the SNP on a number of progressive, environmental and social issues. So ultimately, I do want to get Greens in government. But you're right, we've got to, start from where we are. Our policies, contrary to how other political parties work, are set democratically by our members, one member, one vote at conference. So in the Labour Party, there is voting, but it's weighted, and B, the leader can unilaterally veto anything that they disagree with. So there was a vote a couple of years at Labour Party conference for a proportional voting system. I think it won, I can't remember what the percentage was. It won a majority of support at conference, and it's supported by about 80% of Labour Party members. But Keir Starmer doesn't personally like proportional representation, so it didn't go in the manifesto, and it's not happening. So to answer specifically your policy-making point, our members, and I have no more vote on that than any other Green Party member, and I like it that way, our members set policy based on the climate science, in the case of environmental policies, and on what we think is right for the country. It is not cynically writing policy in order to try and win a certain percentage of the vote. And the thing is, we know in the Green Party that a majority of the British public agree with us on many policy areas. Not being big-headed about this, but just there is polling that shows that a large and consistent majority of the British public want to see public ownership of public services. It's consistently 60-70%, and yet it is only the Green Party that supports bringing the big five energy retail companies, the water companies and so on back into public ownership. Labour have now joined us on that, on rail and buses, which is welcome. That's something we've been campaigning on for over a decade. Likewise on everything from making our tax system fairer, introducing wealth taxes is hugely publicly supported, a ceasefire in Gaza, hugely publicly supported. And yet, very often, it's the Green Party standing alone offering those policies. Now, we know that the reason people have historically not voted for us in very large numbers, although thank you to the nearly 2 million people who did this time, is that people thought we couldn't get in, rather than because they disagreed with our policies. And so we were targeted, but it wasn't targeting in terms of cynically adopting wishy-washy, middle-of-the-ground policies in order to get more people to vote for us. It is being proud of our policies that offer real hope and real change to the electorate, because we think that's what the country needs, and we know that most people agree with us. But targeting the seats we campaign in, because we know that with our broken electoral system, that's the best way of getting more Green MPs elected. And so now that we've quadrupled our representation, yeah, we're not in government, but we can help to move the Overton window, so the envelope of what seems to be politically possible. We can actively take part in that debate in the chamber in the House of Commons, not just on the TV. I've spoken in the Commons chamber 10 times already, including motions, amendments, questions to ministers. And again, it's all that same principle that I spoke about earlier, that we will work with the Labour government on areas where we agree, but we won't be shy about pushing them to go further. And that's not a cynical electoral thing, that's a doing what's best for the country thing.
Dominic, I want to ask you, I suppose, about activism. And if I understand correctly, Dale, it seems like you sort of had an analysis of Just Stop Oil where it was important to begin with because it was raising this important demand, but then it became divisive to the extent that sort of the Tories could take advantage of it, and maybe then it was a bit counterproductive because it was sort of turning people against the climate movement. Am I sort of on the right track?
Not against the climate movement per se, but it could have been used as a weapon during the upcoming election.
Right.
to get us another Tory term of government.
Great. And I suppose, Dominic, I wanted to put that to you in terms of where you think climate activism has been sort of productive at getting people on side, where it might have been, there might have been risks of being unproductive in terms of turning people off or making an issue more divisive when actually you want to try and win a big majority towards it. And I suppose, what have you learned over your years involved in climate activism about what you think is effective and what you think might be less so?
Yeah, of course. So I'll start off with a bit of context in my activism that I do. So I started off being part of organising the youth climate strikes, and they were particularly big in about 2019, and young people across the country and across the world were part of leading the largest environmental movement in history. And from then, the youth climate movement has only grown and gained. And it's been incredibly, incredibly impactful, not just in terms of getting more people on side and engaging more people and educating more people about the climate crisis, but also in campaigning and directly, to government and campaigning with MPs. There have even been political leaders who have said that they have put forward climate policies in the European Parliament, for example, because of the climate movement. So I think its impact cannot be underestimated. And I think it's also important to look that we need both. So to have, climate justice, we need everything essentially to change in society, especially the system that is based so much on exploitation of people and our natural resources and extraction, and capitalism and colonialism that has fueled the climate crisis. And so to do this, we need the policy in place. Practically, that is what we need. And so actually having a government that is promising things in this line that are more sustainable and more green than we've ever seen is important, but we also need the people power at the grassroots. And throughout history, we have seen just how incredibly powerful people and movements are at putting pressure on leaders and actually creating change. And it is incredibly important that, we have both. And I know there is a conversation around, protests kind of turning people away. And I think if we look again back in history at the kind of protests that made an impact, that we look back at now, we think about, the civil rights movement, we think about the suffragettes, and we look at where we are now, and that didn't kind of spring out of nowhere. In a crisis that we are in now, there are so many different types of groups with so many different types of tactics and strategies, and all of that is part of moving us towards this sustainable future that we need. And there is a lot of variety in actions as well, just touching on the point earlier about creating versus stopping things. And in the mainstream climate movement, we do talk a lot about stopping projects, but it is also very important that we talk about what kind of future we're going to create and the solutions that we want. And I think that's also, where politics can have a big part to play as well, and in people pushing that. I mean, look at how the Greens have gained, four MPs in Parliament. That's, from the power, from people power. Look at the place that we are in now when it comes to climate action, and so many other issues, like the amount of people pushing for, a ceasefire in Palestine and everything that's going on. I think at the heart of that is people power, and I think that should never be underestimated.
Can I get a huge round of applause for our panel? Carla Dania, Dominique Palmer and Dale Vince, thank you so much for speaking to us here today.